This is a Dynamite Network podcast.
Hi, welcome to the Dynamic Duel Podcast, a weekly show where we review superhero films and debate the superiority between Marvel and DC by comparing their characters in stat-based battle simulations. I'm Johnny DC.
And I'm his twin brother, Marvelous Joe.
And in this episode, we are doing a review of Season 2 of the HBO and Cartoon Network Adult Swim series, My Adventures with Superman.
It's a good show, people. If you're not watching it, go watch My Adventures with Superman because it's probably one of the best modern adaptations of the character that you can get. And I think Season 2 was a worthy successor to Season 1.
Yeah, absolutely, totally agree. We're going to talk all about Season 2 later on in this episode. Not too much later because there's actually no news for this episode. This is sort of the calm after the storm that is Comic-Con.
But as always, we list our segment times in our episode description, so feel free to check out the show notes if you want to skip ahead to a particular topic. And guys, our artificially intelligent duel simulator, AJ9K, has a quick message for our listeners, so listen up.
Why, hello there. Do you want even more from this podcast? Then become a part of the Dynamic Duel community on Patreon, where you can choose from 3 tiers. The Dynamic 2.0 tier gives you access to our Discord chat server, the Fantastic 4 tier gives you 2 bonus episodes each month, and the X-Force tier makes you an executive producer of this show. Lastly, the Dynamite Podcast Network tier lets you create your own podcast using this Monte Carlo simulator. Johnny and Joe will help you develop your show, provide graphic support and consultation, and get you simulation results. Pitch the twins your ideas via email at dynamicduelpodcast@gmail.com. Check it out at patreon.com/dynamicduel. Pip pip cheerio.
Thanks, AJ9K, and thanks to everyone who supports the podcast, including our newest executive producer, Josh Liner.
Welcome aboard, good sir. Be sure to join the rest of the executive producers on our Discord chat server where we determine the content coming up on this podcast.
Everyone else, be sure to tune into the shows in the Dynamite Podcast Network this week, including Max Destruction, which pits your favorite action heroes from film and television against each other. This week, hosts Ken and Scotty are pitting the Power Rangers Megazord against Voltron. It's going to be a great episode, an important episode, so make sure to tune into that.
On the Senjo World podcast, host Zachary Hepburn speculates on fights between fan-favorite anime and manga characters. The show is making its Season 3 premiere this Thursday, and Zach's kicking things off with a matchup between Hiei of Yu Yu Hakusho and Yuta Okatsu of Jujutsu Kaisen.
And on the Console Combat podcast, hosts John and Dean find out who would win in fights between popular video game characters. In yesterday's episode, they determined who would win between Dante from Devil May Cry versus Bayonetta.
Visit dynamicpodcasts.com or click the link in our show notes to listen to all the shows in the Dynamite Podcast Network. But with that out of the way,
quick to the No Prize!
A No Prize is an award Marvel used to give out to fans. Our version, the Dynamic Duel No Prize, is a digital award we post on Instagram for the person that we feel gave the best answer to our question of the week. Last week's question, we asked you guys, what the fuck? After we got the news that Robert Downey Jr. is returning to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, not as Iron Man, but as Dr. Doom, and we wanted to get your guys' thoughts on it. We got a lot of answers, actually, so let's go ahead and run down our honorable mentions as well as the No Prize winner.
Our first honorable mention goes to Peter Troll, who said,
"What's up, guys? It's Peter. So track with me for a second. Tony Stark is the Sacred Timeline's anchor being. With the knowledge that we know from Deadpool and Wolverine, you can take an anchor being from another universe and bring him into your universe. So the Fantastic Four universe is going to bring in Tony Stark's Dr. Doom, and he's going to become the new MCU timeline anchor being. Therefore, he'll restore the MCU to its former greatness. That's my theory. Thank you guys for listening."
And that's actually a pretty interesting theory. Of course, if you haven't seen Deadpool and Wolverine, I don't want to spoil anything, but they introduced the concept of anchor beings to a timeline, and if that anchor being is somehow killed, then that timeline starts to deteriorate. making Tony Stark the anchor being for the MCU's sacred timeline would actually kind of explain why the MCU has sucked as of recently. It's just deteriorating.
Shut your mouth, first of all. But second of all, yeah, I mean, I guess that's a solid theory. If it turns out that Tony Stark was the anchor being and the heroes learn that he was the anchor being and they go and they try to find a new anchor being going into the Fantastic Four universe, pull that Doctor Doom into the new world because in the Fantastic Four universe, Doctor Doom is a Tony Stark variant. Sure, I mean, it could work. It's still not better than getting the actual true Doctor Doom, but it would be one way to rationalize why Robert Downey Jr. would be the character of Doctor Doom in an alternate universe.
Great answer, Peter. Our next honorable mention goes to Travis Bailey, who said,
Travis here. Shout out to my good twin. Man, it's been too long. All right, listen. Everybody's hot. Everybody's freaking out. I get it. But what y'all don't understand is that Robert Downey Jr. is one of them. He ain't even an actor. He's a thespian. All right, go do a film out. Man got range. He is not going to be Stark as Doom. He will be Victor Von Doom. And it is going to break our hearts. He's going to pull this multiversal mess out of the fire.
All right, so basically what Travis said there was that Robert Downey Jr. is too good of an actor for this not to be good, basically. And if he can convince audiences that he is an entirely different person and he never takes off the mask and he changes his voice completely, maybe I could see this working. But I don't want to know it's him. I don't want to feel that it's him. I wish I could just scrub the idea that it's him out of my brain and then maybe go into it thinking it's just someone else.
To me, that's the only way this successfully works. I don't want to know it's Robert Downey Jr., which kind of seems weird because he is such a big actor. You figure that he would want to get his face out there and let people know it's him. And I mean, the guy just won an Oscar, right?
I don't want to equate Victor Von Doom with Tony Stark in any way, shape, or form. So yeah, hopefully he could pull that off. Hopefully that's his approach. Great answer, Travis. Our next honorable mention goes to Miggy Matanguihan, who said,
Hey, what's up, guys? This is Miggy, and I actually really like this news because it just shows how desperate Marvel is, and it's so fun to see the MCU die in real time. It just, yeah, like I said, it shows that they're not really the house of ideas; they're the mouse house, and all they care about is money. They don't care about storytelling. That was always obvious, but this just makes it like that much obvious, and really separates the true comic fans from the MCU stans.
That's right. If you like Robert Downey Jr. as Doctor Doom, you're not a true Marvel fan. Hashtag fake fan.
Miggy telling it like it is. You hate to hear it, but doesn't mean he's wrong. We won't hold the fact that he's a DC fan against him. I think he's right in that the decision of Robert Downey Jr.'s casting as Doctor Doom is really separating the comic book fans from your basic MCU fans who aren't familiar with the source material. I think if you're a fan of Doctor Doom from the comic books, the idea of Tony Stark being Doctor Doom is offensive and totally not in keeping with the character. But if you're mostly a fan of the movies, then you're probably more excited to see Robert Downey Jr. return more than anything else, not really being aware of the characterization of Doctor Doom from the comics, who is one of Marvel's greatest villains of all time, who we still have yet to see portrayed in an accurate manner on the big screen.
Is there a run from the comics of Doctor Doom that you would recommend for people to read who aren't familiar?
That is a great question. There's a few that come to the top of my head, including the Doctor Strange and Doctor Doom Triumph and Torment miniseries. There was the Doom War miniseries. That's one word, Doom War. Books of Doom was pretty good. There was also the recent Doctor Doom run that came out in 2019 or 2020, I think. It was about 10 issues and ended spectacularly. And basically any Fantastic Four arc dealing with Doctor Doom, I would recommend because they're all good. Also, the first Secret Wars that came out in the 80s. That was also a good showcase for Doctor Doom. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of great books with him.
And of course, anyone not familiar with him can go back to one of our earliest episodes where we pit Superman against Doctor Doom in a duel.
Yeah, you could definitely find out a lot about his history in that episode.
Great answer, Miggy. We want to give a quick shout out to Alex, Sarah Smore, Kat Stevenson, Cornelius Robinson, and Travis Bailey's twin, Travis Herndon, for taking the time to visit our website and record an answer.
Yeah, great answer, guys. No one gave a bad answer for this question of the week. You guys all really gave compelling thoughts on this divisive issue. But the winner of this week's No Prize goes to Waldo, who said,
Hey guys, Waldo here. I am convinced and choosing to believe that it is some kind of a mislead, both in our world and in the MCU. So maybe throughout the film it'll be RDJ as Doom, but then at some point the real, not yet known actor will come out and be the actual Doom and say this is a Doom bot or just some kind of ploy. What do you think?
To me, this is the best case scenario. I think if Doctor Doom is so genius so as to make one of his Doom bots assume the appearance of the 616 universe's greatest heroes just to cause confusion amongst everybody and make them easier to defeat if they're really hesitant to fight against someone who resembles their beloved Tony Stark, that sounds like a pretty sinister plan in my mind. And I would not mind that at all. Have the Tony Stark looking Doctor Doom just be a ploy, a puppet controlled by the real Doctor Doom lurking in the shadows.
I do think it's kind of dumb that Marvel would pull this kind of trick on the fans that Robert Downey Jr. is Doctor Doom. Psych! No, he's not. But also, that may just be the most acceptable way for this casting to work.
It's just all part of Doom's plan, because that's what Doom does. He plans. He's like Marvel's Batman, but like way better. Like way fucking better. Because he uses magic. Why Batman doesn't use magic, even though he knows the occult exists, we don't know. He only studies science, like a dum-dum. Dr. Doom knows science and magic. And he can fucking fly. Get out of here with your Batman, DC fans. Dr. Doom.
Yeah, he's the guy who got beat by Squirrel Girl.
God damn it. Great answer, Waldo. You win this week's No Prize. If you, the listener, want a shot at winning your own No Prize, stay tuned to later on this episode when we'll be asking another question of the week. And now that that's done,
on to the not news, obviously, on to the question of the week.
This is a Dynamite Network question, guys. Other than Dynamic Duel, what is your favorite podcast in the Dynamite Network and why? You choose between Max Destruction, Senjo World, or Console Combat. Just let us know. We'd love to hear your answers.
Record your answer at dynamicduel.com by clicking on the red microphone button in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, which will prompt you to leave us a voicemail. Your message could be up to 30 seconds long, and don't forget to leave your name in case we include you on the podcast. We'll pick our favorite answer and award that person a Dynamic Duel No Prize that we'll post to Instagram. Be sure to answer before August 10th. But now let's move on to the main event of this episode, where we review Season 2 of the animated series, My Adventures with Superman. Okay, My Adventures with Superman is an animated anime-style series that debuts on the Cartoon Network's Adult Swim programming block alongside Warner Bros. Max streaming platform. It just wrapped its second season, and it continues to be a charming, fun, and unique adaptation of the Superman mythos. As we mentioned in our 4.5 out of 5 review of Season 1, we were surprised by how good the show turned out to be, and those surprises continue into Season 2 as the writers take alternative approaches with characters and story elements that make the show just a joy to watch. Now, Season 2 is not as good as Season 1, I'll just say, but barely. I highly recommend this show to anyone, comic fan or not, especially anyone who claims to not like Superman or find him boring, because this show proves just how storytellers can continue to make an 80-something-year-old character feel special. If you haven't seen Season 2 yet, make sure you're caught up before listening to this spoiler review.
I agree that Season 2 is not as good as Season 1, but only barely. You know, Season 1 was special because it introduced a lot of the power discovery elements, as well as the secret identity stuff involving his best friend and the girl that he likes discovering who he really is. You didn't have any of that going into Season 2, which was a big part of the charm of Season 1, I think. But Season 2 still had a lot going for it.
Right, yeah. I mean, that's a big part of its charm, but I would say the biggest appeal of My Adventures with Superman as a show, as a concept, is the shonen anime approach to its storytelling. Shonen is a genre of anime that's essentially action-packed coming-of-age stories that often focus on themes of friendship and perseverance. Shows like Dragon Ball, Naruto, My Hero Academia, Pokemon, One Piece, these are all examples of shonen anime. And it's not a style I would have thought worked for Superman until I saw season 1 of this show, because it seems like Superman was tailor-made for the genre. That shouldn't have been surprising, maybe in hindsight, because, as many anime fans have noticed, there's not all too much difference between characters like Superman and Goku. Now, I don't watch a lot of anime, but my hands-down favorites, like My Hero Academia, Sword Art Online, or Neon Genesis Evangelion, all fall into the shonen genre, and it's always surprising how well shows like those seem to effortlessly transition between subgenres. Like, they tend to be very action-packed, but the characters are also waxing poetic in this very dramatic way as they're fighting, just adding layers of drama and heart and character to the ordeal. Shonen can be comedic one episode, adventure-focused the next, horrifying the episode after that, which is something you don't often see in Western media. My Adventures with Superman is no different, as it feels like a near-perfect balance of comedy, action, romance, and even a sprinkling of horror this season. And it does it while managing to remain pretty family-friendly. Unlike other anime, this show is devoid of gore and blood or even overt sexuality, which sounds lame, but I actually love having an anime show that I could watch with my kids, particularly if it's DC.
But it's not overly kiddie. I mean, maybe the first few episodes of season 1, I kind of thought that the show was overly kid-oriented. But ever since then, I think it's definitely a show that's complex enough to appeal to older audiences as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Like a lot of good animes, the show knows to take its themes and its characters and the drama behind the characters very seriously. Its characters are very complex, which to me is a sign of a really good anime. Now, it helps that the show has a lead character as wholesome as Clark Kent. The show revolves around him, specifically his relationships as he's starting out in the city and his job and meeting all these new people. And that's another thing unique to this series that I'm sure Superman fans will notice. Clark is the main character here, not Superman. Superman in this show is essentially the mask that Clark wears, and this is something we talked about in our season 1 review. It's like the opposite of Christopher Reeve's Superman, or you could argue even Henry Cavill's. And somehow they find ways to make his supporting cast of Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen more relevant than I think they've felt in decades, in that they're not just there for Superman to rescue, but they are often active participants in defeating bad guys, and sometimes they're the ones that outright save Superman himself. I feel like it shouldn't work on paper, but in this show, it does.
If you told me that they were releasing a Superman animated television series in which Superman's not only the only main character, but that Lois and Jimmy would often be involved in his adventures and saving his life, I tell you to go fuck yourself, because that sounds like shit.
Really?
But no, it's actually, for some reason, you're right, it does work. And I think it has to do with the idea of the relationships established between the main characters. They are, very close. They have a very tight friendship. And working together is just one of the primary themes of the show, and it works really well.
Yeah, part of the joy of watching the show as a longtime fan of the Superman comics is seeing how they adapt the saga that is Superman. Like, in the past, Lois and Jimmy were always clueless as to Superman's secret identity. So you weren't really able to tell stories like this in Superman's early days, because in this show, Jimmy and Lois from season 1 know that Clark Kent is Superman. So that's an interesting adaptation or reinvention, but it's also cool to see how they change things like Krypton, or how Superman's powers manifest, or even how his villains come about. In season 1, all of his villains utilized Kryptonian technology. We got a little bit of that this season, but primarily in season 2, his main antagonists were straight up Kryptonian, namely Supergirl and Brainiac. And I loved some of the choices they made for those characters and adapting them for this show. Like Supergirl, starting off as a foe who's been brainwashed by Brainiac, I thought was genius. And it was a great way to introduce the threat that is Brainiac, which, in this show is kind of like Superman the Animated Series, in that he's a Kryptonian AI construct, though here he was programmed specifically to aid in war and conquest.
Yeah, I thought the way they adapted Supergirl and Brainiac for the show was fantastic. I think that's actually when this season started getting good, because I was not thrilled with the first half of this season. Like, I liked the stuff with Steel. That episode was pretty good. But once Supergirl came into the picture, I was a lot more invested in where the story was going, as opposed to, just dealing with the Sam Lane and Amanda Waller stuff from the previous season.
Yeah, for me, it really picked up during the Star Labs Symposium, where Lex Luthor kind of starts to turn public opinion against Superman. I thought that was really interesting. And I think Supergirl appeared the episode after that. So I would agree with you. Second half is much better than the first half. And of course, the second half is where we got Brainiac. And admittedly, I didn't like every adaptation they made for Brainiac. This series made him into an amalgamation, really, of 3 different Superman villains. You, of course, have Brainiac, but also Mongol, and that he'd conquer civilizations and then force their champions to fight. And like Mongol, Brainiac also had a psychic weapon known as the Black Mercy, but instead of an alien plant, it was Kryptonian technology.
That's right. I remember seeing the show and hearing the reference to Black Mercy, but I forgot what it was a reference to. And you just reminded me that it's a weaponized plant used by Mongol.
Right, yeah. To trap beings in this false reality from which they would never want to escape from. That's exactly what Brainiac did to Superman this season. But also, Brainiac had shades of Darkseid in how they depicted his missiles and lasers zigzagging across the sky. It's a very little nitpick, but it does make me question how they're planning to differentiate someone like Darkseid if they ever decide to introduce him to the show in the future.
And also, I think it would be hard to springboard characters like Zod or like the Eradicator or people like that.
Yeah, totally. They even mentioned Eradicator in this season. Eradicator was a protocol that Brainiac used to brainwash Kara, apparently. I think that's what it was. But you're absolutely right. They totally pulled a red herring at the end of season 1 when we thought the villain was going to be Zod, but it turns out the character who was talking about his enemies kneeling was Kara.
Right.
That was an interesting twist.
I like Brainiac as a Superman villain, though, so I'm glad that they went with him. They just weren't very comic book accurate in his depiction.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. Brainiac, in my opinion, is the best Superman villain. He is the Joker to Superman's Batman. And I'm totally fine with them making him this ultimate Superman villain for this show. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if they bring him back next season. I think he'll come back. I think the show does a decent job of actually building up Lex Luthor as also a big bad for season 3, which has already been greenlit. And they've even introduced the potential this season for the Death of Superman storyline, with the introductions of characters like Steel and Hank Henshaw, the future cyborg Superman. So I'm excited for what we have upcoming with this series. There's a ton of potential.
The Death of Superman storyline would be pretty dark for this show in particular to adapt. But if they were to do it, I know they would do a great job, just because they have a solid approach to most of the story arcs in this series.
Yeah, and again, the relationships they have established, how devastating that would be to Lois Lane. More so in this show than maybe other adaptations of Superman.
Right.
Like I said, the show does a great job of adapting the source material. Not all of the adaptations worked, but the thing that actually bothered me more than some of those adaptations was the numerous unanswered questions that were left by the end of the season. How did Clark have those visions of his ship at the beginning of this season? He didn't know how he had them, and they never followed up on that. Clark had new powers that manifested, but how is he able to do that? And why him? Brainiac seemed interested in that, so I thought we'd get some kind of answer, but we didn't. And then there's small things like why were the Kryptonian suits able to adapt to space if they didn't need to? Seemed pointless. And why was the Kryptonian space station Kandor falling apart? And why was it a space station instead of a shrunken city?
Yeah, I remember scratching my head in some moments, like when Supergirl realized that she had been destroying these planets. There was kind of a weird time jump there that I didn't quite follow.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So again, not a perfect season. There were a lot of little things that bothered me, but ultimately, I feel like the characters made up for a lot of that. So let's talk about the characters in our character breakdown. Starting with Clark Kent / Superman, voiced by Jack Quaid of The Boys fame. Now, he does a fantastic job doing the voice of Clark, so much so that I don't even recognize him as Jack Quaid. It just comes across as this natural performance of a really young, really earnest Superman. Superman's arc this season revolved around alienation, isolation, and rejection. As he learns more about himself, he feels the sense that he's different from everyone, and it's not really something he feels that others, even those closest to him like Lois, can relate to. Not realizing that actually Lois and Supergirl have arcs dealing with alienation as well this season, particularly when it comes to their fathers. Now, Superman loses his father in episode 1, and with him, any hope for more answers, unless he can find his cousin. Because Superman seeks someone to relate to, he reaches out to Supergirl, knowing Lois would probably disapprove, and later when Lex Luthor successfully turns public opinion against him, and even Jimmy and Lois seemingly reject him, he discovers when he meets Kara that his Kryptonian heritage isn't exactly honorable, and that perhaps some things were better off left unknown. Ultimately, though, Superman is Superman, and despite Kara's attacks, he shows her grace in the end and essentially kills her with kindness, helping her be reborn in this new identity as a protector of Earth rather than a conqueror. And in that, he finds someone that he can teach and help grow, and find someone who's Kryptonian to relate to in that way.
Yeah, it was a much more, I guess, mature arc than he had in the first one, which was really about discovery. The first season was really about discovery of himself, of love, and things like that. And after he learns who he is, he discovers a little bit more about how that affects those around him. It makes me think that he and Lois have a terrible communication problem because they went multiple episodes just trying to tell each other something very important. You know, Clark in regards to his cousin and Lois in regards to her father. And they never quite got around to it, or they never really made the time for it until it was too late. And you have kind of like a Romeo and Juliet situation where tragedy strikes before they can actually speak with each other.
Yeah, communication is a tricky thing. Even, for me, someone who's been married 16 years, it's a delicate balance. And even here, they're not communicating because they're putting the other person's needs ahead of their own, which is something that you think is probably a good thing to do. But again, it needs to be a balance.
Right. You need to prioritize your own needs, of course, as well as your partner's. And if they had done that, maybe Clark would have been less insecure about his relationship with Lois and maybe wouldn't have been as susceptible to brainwashing by Brainiac and stuff like that. Who knows?
Maybe.
But even Jimmy had a communication problem, and they could have found out about Supergirl long before they actually did.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Now, one of the things I really like about this show is the character designs. They're, of course, very different from what we see in the comics. But I do just have to say that I hated the costume design of Superman's end-of-season suit with, the pointy shoulders and the lack of trunks. It was awful. It was really bad.
Yeah, the belt looked stupid. At least, they still have the same emblem, which is a solid Superman emblem. One of my favorite adaptations of that logo of all time. But you're right. The pointy shoulders were doing nothing for me. He already has broad shoulders. Why are you making them pointy? I guess it's to make it look more like armor, but Superman shouldn't look like he's wearing armor.
I don't know. I think an armor look is fine, just as long as the shoulders are not padded so heavily. I feel like they were trying to make the design look more similar to the design they gave for Supergirl, which I actually thought was a really cool design, both when, it was bright blue and when it was black. I loved her costumes. But yeah, it just didn't work. They should have kept him at what he was, in my opinion. But moving on to Lois Lane, who's voiced by Alice Lee. She gives the most endearing voice performance of Lois Lane to date. And that's saying a lot because, Dana Delaney was iconic as Lois Lane in Superman the Animated Series. Alice Lee has all of that spunk, but I feel also gives a little bit more depth emotionally to the character as well. Now, like Superman's arc, alienation was something Lois derived from both Superman and her father this season, as she felt ignored and abandoned by both. And that isolation, inferiority, and inadequacy was something her father unintentionally instilled in her since she was a young girl in an attempt to make her more capable and independent. In a way, it helped her become the hotshot she is today, but it also resulted in pent-up resentment of her father and a general distrust of perhaps male figures in general. That distrust, combined with her feelings of inadequacy, combined with her survival instinct, resulted in her breaking up with Superman. Which, who does that?
What a dumbass. Lois
Jeez.
pissed me off a lot of times this season. Like, there was a time where she just volunteered Clark and Jimmy to house her father, knowing full well that he could possibly learn Clark's secret identity. You know, she didn't even consult with them on that. She just was being a selfish dickhead, just not being very considerate. You know, there was also the time when she like heavily pushed Clark to act single in the most eligible bachelor thing that they had going on. And then when he did, she got like super fucking upset and then broke up with him. Like, what the hell was that all about? What a dumbass.
Yeah, that was bullshit. That was not right. Regarding her father staying with Jimmy and Clark, I think she wanted to keep her father close, of course, because those are her best friends, and figured that if he was going to be safe with anyone, it was going to be Clark. Now, after the breakup, she, of course, realized how foolish she was when Superman was kidnapped by Supergirl, and she realized that her feelings for him were more important than her perceived assumptions about his feelings toward her. By the end, the love that Lois and Superman had for each other saved Superman by pulling him out of the false reality he was in, a paradise of sorts, because he realized that life with her was greater than a potential life on Krypton. And that's just relationship goals.
Yeah, I want to punch through a force field with my wife, too.
Looks like so much fun. Our love can break through any barrier. Pow! It's sweet. And moving on to Jimmy Olsen, he's voiced by Ishmael Saeed. Now, Jimmy's an important character to the show in that he's so incredibly loyal and helpful to both Lois and Clark, so much so that he's often a major catalyst in resolving conflicts, especially this season since he started off as a multimillionaire. I wish everyone had a friend like Jimmy, you know, someone who's just ready to drop literally millions of dollars to help a pal out without them even asking for it. I don't think I could be as good a friend to anyone as Jimmy is to Lois and Clark. In fact, if I ever make millions of dollars, there's a good chance that I'm going to be suspicious of anyone who still wants to be my friend.
I wouldn't tell anybody.
Right, exactly. Yeah, you ever win the Powerball, you keep that shit to yourself. Because if I know about it, I'm going to be like, bro, help a brother out.
It was heartbreaking to see just how fast he was going through his bank account.
Oh, dude, for real. I was like, no. Gotta invest. Anyway, during this season, Jimmy causes some conflicts as well, though, inspiring not only Lex Luthor's rise to power, but also failing to refute Lex's ideological opposition to Superman as a savior of humanity. Jimmy knows Superman is selfless, but convincing others is a challenge because it requires a considerable degree of faith. And Jimmy definitely had a crisis of faith here when he wasn't able to refute Lex Luthor in that symposium debate. And of course, that was compounded later on in the season when Superman actually turned bad because he was possessed by Brainiac. But ultimately, Jimmy knew that Clark was possessed, and he maintained that Clark would overcome and help humanity, and he was proven right at the end. I will absolutely miss, leader of the Daily Planet Jimmy, and I wonder what they're going to do with the character next season.
Well, I think he'll continue to be a romantic interest for Supergirl, but yeah, he won't be as rich as he used to be.
Moving on to Kara Zor-El, she was voiced by Kiana Madeira. I thought it was interesting that they made her a baby on Krypton because usually in depictions of Supergirl, she was at least a teenager on Krypton. And part of her arc has always revolved in coping with the loss of her life that she had on Krypton, and that her baby cousin was now this older champion of a foreign world whose shadow she has to live under. By making her a baby in this series, she's made much more susceptible to manipulation by someone like Brainiac, who convinces her that he's her father and raises her under his nationalistic ideology that Krypton is superior to all and is doing other worlds a favor by conquering them. When Kara gets Superman's beacon call, she betrays her father in her excitement that she would have a partner to spread the Kryptonian Empire with, but when she deems Superman as weak, she fights and kidnaps him in an effort to reprogram his supposed brainwashing, only to later learn that she was the one actually being brainwashed and hypnotized by the being she considered her father. But like I said earlier, Superman's grace and showing of kindness causes her to realize the error of Brainiac's ways as she becomes Superman's ally and a fellow protector.
It was nice that despite the fact that she was this world-conquering warrior, she had this soft spot that was highly sentimental down deep inside of her, who cared about people like Jimmy Olsen. And, she kept all these trinkets from the worlds that she had explored, not really knowing that she had actually destroyed most of them.
Which is wild. That's crazy.
Yeah. It's a great take on the character, I think.
Absolutely. I loved it. I loved everything about Supergirl in this series. Lastly, let's move on to Brainiac Primus, the Prime Brainiac, who is voiced in this series by Michael Emerson, who you may recognize from shows like Lost or Person of Interest or Saw.
I didn't like his voice for Brainiac.
What? I loved it.
It was too dweeby.
No, that's perfect for Brainiac, though. It was dweeby and sinister.
It wasn't that sinister, though.
He was super sinister this season. He was like angry and evil. It was perfect.
It wasn't menacing at all to me.
I don't get how that was not menacing.
He sounded like Mandark from Dexter's Laboratory.
No.
That's exactly the take that I got from his performance. And I never got over it, even in the last episode. I kept wishing that they had gone for a more imposing voice for this destructive robot.
I completely disagree with you. I think the voice performance was fantastic. This actor has actually done other voice performances for DC Comics. He was the Joker voice in Batman The Dark Knight Returns 2-part animated series.
Yeah, I don't think Brainiac should sound anything like Joker. And this Brainiac kind of did.
Well, that's interesting. Should Brainiac sound like Joker? What do you want Brainiac to sound like?
I want him to sound more like how he did in Superman the Animated Series. I thought that was a great voice.
I liked that this one had more character. Yes, Brainiac should sound robotic, which he did in this show, but also had real emotion, like anger, like I mentioned. He was just dripping with that.
I think he comes across as scarier when he's void of emotion, kind of in a Hell 9000 kind of way.
No, I loved the performance here. You don't know what the hell you're talking about. You don't know Brainiac.
He's too logical to be that emotional.
Well, no, you can't be full of malice when you're devoid of emotion.
Sure you can. Look at sociopaths.
Well, you're not going to fucking sound like it, at least.
Okay.
And that's the thing here, is that this version of Brainiac was full of passion. He was full of emotion because he was willing to murder an entire planet just to survive and not be taken offline when the prospect of peace was being put forth by Jor-El. Like Hell 9000, the guy just wanted to survive because he considered himself to be alive as, a robotic, intelligent life form. And I think that takes emotion.
No, it just takes a need for survival.
You're on the wrong side of history.
He acted more like Ultron in this one. Ultron is often characterized as being very emotional, despite the fact that he is an artificial being. Whereas Brainiac, I always pictured as more, logical. Like his depiction in Superman Red Sun, I think was one of the more recent depictions of him. I thought that was pretty good.
That's fair. He probably was more like Ultron than Brainiac. But again, I liked the adaptation for this series. What did you think of the look of Brainiac?
Didn't like it either. The weird, hammerhead shark face kind of thing. It was weird. Didn't look like the character from the comics.
You're such a fucking purist, it disgusts me. You just want some green alien-looking guy? Come on.
No, I just wanted something a little bit more recognizable, I guess.
All you need is those 3 dots. You slap that on anything, it's fucking Brainiac.
Yeah, but it's like they shaped his whole head around that 3-dot motif, and I don't know, it just seemed lazy and
good. I'm glad they did that.
All right.
In a world where fantasies collide and heroes clash, one podcast network rises above the rest. Prepare yourself for the ultimate showdowns in comic books, video games, movies, and anime. The Dynamite Podcast Network presents Console Combat, where video game legends brawl every Monday. Dynamic Duel, where comic book titans smash every Tuesday. Max Destruction, where TV and action heroes battle every Wednesday. And Sendro World, where anime champions clash every Thursday. Join us as we speculate on the matches and, armed with the power of mathematical simulations, discover who will emerge victorious. Visit dynamicpodcast.com, where we settle the debate and settle the score.
Let's move on past Brainiac. Let's move on to the story highlights. Episode 1 was titled More Things in Heaven and Earth. As Clark struggles to plan the perfect Valentine's date with Lois, the two of them head to Star Labs along with Jimmy to interview Hank Henshaw about a strange meteoroid that disappeared over Antarctica. While there, Jimmy convinces Alex to carve his own path after being rejected from a Star Labs scientist position due to his involvement with Ivo and Mesotech. Realizing that the meteoroid is actually Clark's missing spaceship, the trio used Jimmy's recent fortune to fly to Antarctica to locate it. After being separated by malfunctioning Kryptonian technology, Clark encounters a hologram of his biological father Jor-El, whose translation program finished learning English. Jor-El reveals more of Clark's origins and that he has a cousin, Kara, who was also sent away from Krypton by her father, Zor-El. Meanwhile, Lois and Jimmy discover Amanda Waller along with agents Deathstroke and Damage, who are there to commandeer the alien tech, revealing that they've also taken General Sam Lane prisoner. With the ship malfunctioning from kryptonite and shifting out of dimensional space, Superman fights Damage and Deathstroke until Jor-El uses the spaceship's power to purify the kryptonite and convert it into a fortress, teleporting it seemingly to the other side of the planet at the North Pole. Before shutting down, Jor-El tells Superman to find a beacon to locate Kara. Afterward, Lois asks Clark to help her rescue her father, while Task Force X leaves with the tech they acquired and kryptonite samples.
What did you think of this show's take on the Fortress of Solitude? It's always interesting and unique how each Superman adaptation approaches it, right?
Yeah, they kind of borrowed a little bit of Man of Steel here in that it was his spaceship, but the look of the spaceship, after it was purified from the kryptonite, how it was like still crystalline, I thought was super cool. I loved the way it levitated. I loved the stairs. It was one of the coolest depictions of the Fortress of Solitude that we've ever seen.
Now, one of the prominent henchmen of this series was Damage, who I'm not too familiar with. He kind of looked like the Hulk here, or like a version of Bane. I don't know if he was like all roided up with Kryptonian tech or something like that, but what is his power set from the comics?
Well, there's actually two different versions of a character named Damage in the comics. The one in this series is actually based off of a more recent version of the character that was introduced during the early New 52 days. DC for a time had this thing where they were letting artists create characters and write stories about them. And Damage was one of those characters. I think Sideways was another, and I forget who the others were. But yeah, Damage is a lot like the Hulk.
Interesting. Okay. He and Atomic Skull were pretty cool in this season, I thought.
Yeah, I mean, when we watched the trailers for this season, you and I both thought that Atomic Skull was an interpretation of Metallo. And I was actually kind of disappointed that that wasn't the case, although I should have known better because, yeah, the guy's obviously fucking Atomic Skull. Moving on to episode 2, which was titled Adventures with My Girlfriend. While Waller interrogates General Lane, who's imprisoned in the secret Task Force X headquarters beneath Stryker Island Prison in Metropolis, Clark and Lois agree to help a boy named Billy find his father, who was a volunteer librarian at Stryker's that went missing while investigating other missing persons cases. With Jimmy busy wrangling fellow reporter Steve Lombard and the News Kid Legion, who were made a part of his journalistic video crew, Clark and Lois infiltrate the prison themselves and stumble into its secret basement. While rescuing Sam, they discover Billy's father and other inmates that Waller had been kidnapping to use as test subjects for the alien tech, turning people into weapons such as Atomic Skull, who attacks Superman. As Lois and her father evacuate the inmates, Superman manages to overpower Atomic Skull while also conveniently stumbling upon the beacon Jor-El asked him to find. After a standoff between Superman and the escaping prisoners and Amanda Waller and her task force, Jimmy and his team rescue the escapees via a chartered yacht while press helicopters prevent Waller from stopping or pursuing them. On the yacht, General Lane agrees to stay with Clark and Jimmy, while Alex, now referring to himself as Lex Luthor, joins Waller's team as its chief scientist.
The idea of Waller combining humans with Kryptonian tech in illegal experiments was pretty solid. It was like she was creating a bunch of cyborgs, like the character Cyborg.
Yeah, exactly. And she was creating soldiers to go up against a potential alien threat should the Kryptonians ever decide to invade Earth.
I hate Amanda Waller in the show. She comes across as surprisingly less competent than she typically does in other media, I think.
Really?
Yeah. She never accomplishes anything, and her superiors are always pissed off at her, and she acts like a badass even though she really just kind of sucks.
I mean, she accomplished creating Atomic Skull and Deathstroke and all the other people that she outfitted with Kryptonian tech. What do you mean?
Like, at the end, she was like, I'm going to save my planet. And she takes the gun, and, like, nothing fucking happens. She couldn't even, like, kill the Metallo robots, and then Sam Lane had to save her ass. And she's all talk in this show.
I mean, I guess. It didn't bother me that much.
The only thing she was successful at was declaring martial law and then totally botching Earth's defense. So, congrats, Amanda Waller. You suck.
She tried. Give her some credit for trying.
No,
or at least having the cojones to stand and fight, even with a pistol, even if it does nothing. At the very least, Amanda Waller should have the biggest balls out of anyone, and I thought she did.
Biggest balls, biggest mouth. All right.
Anyway, moving on to episode 3, Full Metal Scientist. While rescuing Amertech scientist Silas Stone from a burning building, Clark unlocks another new power, a super aura tactile force field. After Clark leaves, however, the villain Livewire threatens Silas into remotely deleting all records of a project he was working on. The next day, as Clark struggles to prevent General Lane from learning he's Superman, Lois, Jimmy, and Gotham Gazette lead reporter Vicky Vale separately uncover a mystery surrounding missing scientists Silas and John Henry Irons, Amertech's CEO Thomas Weston, and his line of defense robots codenamed Metallos. As Lois and Vicky compete to outscoop each other, Superman and Jimmy manage to locate Irons, who reveals Weston forced him and Silas to rush production on the Metallos and create an unstable Amer fusion energy reactor to power Amertech's Metropolis facility before firing them. When Livewire attacks Irons, he and Superman join forces to stop Weston before his reactor destroys Metropolis, with Irons using his steel mech suit to fend off the Metallos. After their team-up proves successful, Weston is arrested. Vicky offers Lois a job at the Gazette, and Luthor's new company, LexCorp, buys out Amertech, confiscating the steel suit and Metallos for Task Force X.
I wasn't expecting to see Steel this season, but I thought he was pretty damn awesome.
Yeah, the suit was pretty different, but pretty hardcore from what we're used to seeing from Steel. I do wish they would have given him a helmet, but I'm not complaining about how cool the mech suit was.
Well, I think this is just like his first iteration, his Mark 1, as it were. I think if we see him in the next season, maybe he'll have a helmet, maybe he'll have the S insignia on his chest. I think it would look badass. I like the idea of Steel being a mech as opposed to a more standard Iron Man type suit.
Yeah, I also like that a lot. One interesting thing about this episode is not only did you introduce Steel, but you also introduced something that could potentially set up Reign of the Superman for next season, in that Superman got his tactile telekinesis of sorts in his force field, which is this thing they introduced in the comics during the Dan Jurgens era post-crisis, in that Superman has like a very small force field, which he could also project around things to lift them. It's one of the sources of his strength and durability. It's kind of been retconned out of existence, but that was the rationalization for Superboy's powers, in that when he was cloned from Superman, he developed that tactile telekinesis, though his cloning process was stopped before he developed more of Superman's powers. So introducing that in this episode, I think, is kind of a setup for Superboy, potentially in the next season.
Well, the way that Superman used it in this episode was a lot like how Superboy uses it in the comics. I don't like Superman having this level of tactile telekinesis to the point where he can stop a bomb just by simply touching it and, encasing it in this energy field. It's weird.
Yeah, to me, that's much more of a Superboy thing than a Superman thing, absolutely. But again, I think they did that intentionally, just as setup. Moving on to episode 4, which was titled Two Lanes Diverged. In flashbacks, Lois is trained in the woods as a young girl by her father in survival techniques, though the two gradually become estranged due to his military work. In the present, the paranoid General Lane fears that Waller has found him and leaves for a safe house to prepare, with Lois following him, only to end up in the middle of Task Force X's agents and their attacks against her father. Meanwhile, Jimmy learns he has been invited to serve as a keynote speaker at a Star Lab symposium on aliens, and he invites Clark. While Jimmy debates against Lex Luthor on stage regarding Superman's trustworthiness, Task Force X's attack on Lois and her father spills into the symposium, resulting in a destructive battle with Superman. As Task Force X retreats, Lex uses the aftermath to turn the attendees against Superman. Later that night, while Clark uses the beacon to send a message to Kara, General Lane disappears. Luthor and Waller gain support from Star Labs and the Pentagon, and a Kryptonian warrior approaches Earth. Now, the timing of this episode was a little weird, I thought, because we never see Superman leave the keynote speech to go help the others. Like, I'm really surprised that Lex and Jimmy and the audience don't even realize that a battle is going on outside until they see the aftermath.
Right. Well, it was strange that Sam and Lois escaped the safe house, which I guess happened to be across the street from the conference center where the keynote speech was given. It was just like coincidental in that regard.
Yeah, I didn't love this episode, to be honest. It was probably my least favorite, although it did give really good backstory as to why Lois Lane's relationship with her father was so contentious. Moving on to episode 5, titled Most Eligible Superman. Daily Planet editor Perry White assigns Lois and Clark to interview Superman upon learning he was named a finalist in Metropolis's Most Eligible Singles contest. Ignoring Perry's orders, gossip columnist Cat Grant forces Lois into letting her join her so she can uncover Superman's secret identity. During the contest, Superman's fellow finalist, Silver St. Cloud, develops an obvious interest in him, causing Lois to doubt her relationship with Clark. Meanwhile, as Jimmy struggles to determine how to apologize to Clark after his poor debate performance at the symposium, he encounters Kara Zor-El, who has come to Metropolis to search for her cousin. After Jimmy offers to help her, they bond over touring Metropolis before eventually heading to the contest, where Jimmy learns that Kara was searching for Superman, who is named the winner. Seeing Lois leave angrily, Superman tries to reconcile with her, but she reveals her stress over her father's disappearance, Vicky's job offer, and their frank relationship. Kara, humiliated by Superman's adoration from the public, attacks Superman, deeming him weak and believing he's unfit to join the Kryptonian Empire. Despite Superman unlocking the power of ice breath in their ensuing fight, Kara defeats and captures him on Brainiac's orders.
I'm pretty sure Superman had the power of ice breath prior to this. Did he not? He used freeze breath in season 1. It just manifested much more powerfully here, like ice laser from his mouth.
There was an ice cannon. That's when he developed his heat vision.
Oh, that's right. That's what I'm thinking of then. Yeah.
But yeah, it was like a laser. I actually was very surprised. I thought for a while he had like Godzilla's atomic breath or something like that. I was like, what is this? They're just making up powers for Superman now? But, once the cold started to form on his face, I was like, oh, okay, I got you. I loved how Kara confused Jimmy for being the leader of the planet, because he kept telling everyone how he was a leader at the Daily Planet. Episode 6 was titled The Machine Who Would Be Empire. Superman attempts to escape Kara's spaceship until he misunderstands that Kara is taking him to see his Uncle Jor-El instead of Brainiac. Using a thought projector device, Kara explains that before Krypton fell, it was the most advanced society in the galaxy and invited less fortunate planets to share in their utopia. While debating back and forth whether they should conquer Earth, Clark stumbles upon Kara's secret collection of alien memorabilia, and he asks her to show her a planet the Kryptonian Empire conquered. She takes him to Thanagar, but they find it in ruins, briefly causing Kara to question Brainiac's intentions before his robots bring her and Superman to a space-based satellite headquarters, Kandor. Sending Kara away, Brainiac reveals he is a warmonger willing to kill those who refuse Kryptonian rule before detaining Superman and brainwashing Kara for disobeying him. However, Kara's memorabilia helps her remember her doubt towards Brainiac and the destruction the Kryptonian Empire left behind. While trying to determine what to do next, she encounters a spaceship piloted by Jimmy, Lois, a gorilla named Mala, and his robot lover, the Brain.
Do you think this episode means that we'll never get to see a cameo from Hawkman or Hawkgirl?
I don't think so. I think the potential is there for survivors. I mean, that's also saying like maybe we'll never see Green Lantern just because he showed up here. I don't think it was the specific heroes that we're familiar with. I think there were other champions from those worlds. That said, it was cool to see a Thanagarian Hawk Girl character and a Green Lantern.
The show doesn't have enough greater DC Universe tie-ins. These little like mini cameos, if you could even call them cameos here and there, just aren't sufficient. I think it would be really cool to see the greater Justice League actually have a presence within the universe that this show sets up for Superman.
I would love to see that. Like, I would love to see the show's versions of Wonder Woman and Batman. That'd be really cool.
I mean, we got Vicky Vale. We saw Silver St. Cloud in the last episode. And there are a lot of allusions to Gotham City. And at the end of this season, I actually thought that Lois Lane should have taken Vicky up on her offer to work under her for at least a time at the Gotham Gazette. Clark was like, it only takes me 5 minutes to fly there. If you're willing to go, I'd be fine with it. And then Lois was like, no, I'm going to stay at the planet. I'm like, you idiot. That was the perfect potential for a crossover. I know I'm skipping ahead to the last episode there, but the Thanagar situation kind of makes me think of the greater DC universe.
And the great thing about her taking the job at the Gotham Gazette is that could have all happened off screen. Like by the time we return for season 3, she's like, oh, I'm back from my brief stint at the Gotham Gazette.
Right.
She could have established relationships there that would carry over, including maybe something with Bruce Wayne. I think that would be really cool. It would introduce some interesting conflict to the relationship between Clark and Lois if you were to introduce another potential love interest like Bruce Wayne. That'd be awesome. Moving on to episode 7, which was titled Olsen's 11, which takes place concurrently with the previous episode, in which Waller announces the formation of the Human Defense Corps and places Metropolis under martial law in response to the battle between Superman and Kara, and in preparation for an impending alien invasion. Jimmy and Lois, meanwhile, plan to break into Star Labs and steal an experimental spaceship so they can find Superman by hiring the professional thief Livewire to help them, and recruiting Mala and the Brain, who were capable of creating black hole portals. After secretly debating whether they should use kryptonite on Kara, Jimmy and Lois and their crew discover heightened security at Star Labs due to Waller and Deathstroke's presence, as they're overseeing Lex's upgrades of the Metello robots with kryptonite power cores. Waller discovers the intruder's presence and sends Deathstroke to capture Lois and Jimmy's group. While evading Task Force X and Deathstroke, Livewire seemingly abandons Lois and Jimmy, while Mala and the Brain successfully prep the ship for launch and reconfigure it to generate portals. After Lex's Metello robots nearly prevent the ship from launching, Livewire returns with her Intergang allies, now outfitted with alien tech that they stole from Waller while she was distracted. And Intergang manages to fend off the Metellos and ensure the group's escape in the spaceship. As Waller deems Lex's work successful and allocates more resources for him, Mala and the Brain generate a portal to send them, Lois and Jimmy, deep into space where they encounter Kara. I have to say, I'm not a big fan of Livewire and Intergang, that whole crew, becoming good guys, or at least helping the good guys.
Yeah, that felt really out of character. Maybe not later on in the season when they're like helping defend Earth itself, but I guess in helping Lois and Jimmy, they were able to steal a lot of shit from Task Force X.
But even then, I'm still not 100% sure why that tech and even Lex Luthor's Metello robots were at Star Labs. Like, they didn't own it. Granted, everything was under martial law, but I didn't understand why that put Waller in control of Star Labs.
Yeah, I have no idea.
Episode 8 was titled The Death of Clark Kent. Brainiac uses a psychic device known as a Black Mercy to invade and manipulate Superman's memories, intending to transfer his AI mind into Superman's body before Kandor falls apart. Despite his best efforts, Superman fails to stop Brainiac from learning of Lois and Jimmy, and Brainiac uses his connection to them against Superman, eventually trapping his mind in a simulation where he's with his biological family on a restored Krypton. Meanwhile, Kara, Jimmy, and Lois devise a plan to save Superman, while Mala and the Brain stay behind to repair the spaceship. Jimmy and Lois infiltrate Kandor, while Kara attempts to reason with Brainiac. Frustrated with her perceived rebelliousness, Brainiac confirms that he brainwashed her to serve his interests, and though Kara damages Brainiac's robotic body in response, Brainiac successfully possesses Superman's body in time. Jimmy tries to use the kryptonite on Brainiac, but he is ejected along with Lois and Kara into space before Brainiac teleports Kandor away. After Mala and the Brain rescue the trio, Lois reveals she stole the Black Mercy and uses it on herself in an attempt to save Superman. Again, I didn't love this interpretation of the Black Mercy. Not everything has to be Kryptonian tech. I don't understand why, they couldn't go a more traditional route of making the Black Mercy a plant. I mean, why not?
Kryptonians don't use plants. Come on.
What? Yeah, I can't think of a single one. I have no argument. Moving on to episode 9, which was titled Pierce the Heavens, Superman, which is a horrible title. Actually, all of the titles in this season I didn't love. They don't always make sense.
Well, I'm not usually aware of them. I just click next episode, so a lot of them I'm hearing for the first time as you say them, and I agree, they're not all winners.
In this episode, Kara, Jimmy, and the comatose Lois return to Earth, which they find under the control of Amanda Waller, who kidnaps them. They're rescued by the Daily Planet staff, however, before Super Brainiac launches his invasion of Earth. Kara tries to stop him, but he overpowers her and Task Force X, while Lois mentally continues to attempt to reach Clark within the Black Mercy's virtual reality, while avoiding simulations of Jor-El and his wife Lara, who continually attempt to delete Lois due to the Black Mercy being unable to support multiple minds at once. After repeated resets of the simulation due to Lois's interference, she gradually succeeds in getting through to Clark, and the two join forces to destroy the simulation, forcing Brainiac out of Superman's body. Brainiac retaliates by hacking the Metallos to defeat Kara and a restored Superman, while attempting to use Kandor to destroy Metropolis.
This episode had a neat little Groundhog Day element to it, where every time Lois Lane would get deleted, she'd be reset within the simulation, and she kept reliving the same experience trying to convince Clark to come out of the mind control. And I thought it was used to great effect when he eventually did. They remembered each other, they remembered their love, and used that as a means of escape.
Yeah, that was cool. I also thought it was cool that Lois had superpowers in this virtual reality. There's been instances in the comics where she's had superpowers, and I felt like this was sort of like an homage to that.
It was cool seeing the two fight side by side in cooperation with each other.
Yeah, it was a great moment, I thought, for sure.
I don't know if the justification of Superman saying, I see you as so much more than human, was sound, but the end result was fun to watch, I guess.
Moving on to the final episode, which was titled My Adventures with Supergirl. As the Human Defense Corps fails to protect Metropolis, Waller reunites with General Lane, who recruited Irons along with Livewire and her intergang allies to help Superman. With the group's aid, Superman and Kara overcome the Metallo's kryptonite attacks and reach Kandor, where they confront Brainiac, who reveals he destroyed Krypton in the face of peace talks led by Jor-El that would have led to his shutdown. As Brainiac attempts to brainwash Kara once more, Superman, Lois, and Jimmy help her break Brainiac's control over her. As she and Superman push Kandor away from the Earth toward the sun, they use the sun's energy to strengthen themselves and destroy Kandor before Kara destroys Brainiac's body, though she salvages his core. Big mistake. Afterward, Clark, Lois, and Jimmy bring Kara to Smallville to recover and meet Jonathan and Martha Kent, Clark's adoptive parents. Over the next week, Mala and the Brain rebuild Cadmus Labs with Kara and Jimmy's help. Vicky dubs Kara Supergirl. Waller becomes a fugitive. Luthor establishes LexCorp's headquarters and hires Wilson. Lois turns down Vicky's offer, and Kara joins Clark, Lois, and Jimmy in protecting Metropolis. Now, I thought one of the coolest scenes out of the entire series, both seasons 1 and 2, happened when Superman and Kara were near the sun.
Yeah, that was pretty cool.
Yeah, of course, Kryptonians get their powers from the sun, and it hasn't really been clear that that's been the case in this series, but it looks like it is. And I just love the way that they depicted their Super Saiyan, like, energy modes, as it were.
Yeah, the parts that were infected by the kryptonite were then glowing with sun radiation as opposed to kryptonite radiation. I was wondering at first why Brainiac wasn't susceptible to kryptonite poisoning himself, considering he is kryptonite technology, and we saw people like Livewire and Heatwave be susceptible to kryptonite poisoning as well. But then I remember the throwaway line where Brainiac activated his kryptonite shielding, which somehow made him invulnerable to that. It was probably just lead, you know?
Right. Yeah. His lead body form. That could be perfect rationale. I did feel like they ran out of time on this episode, the way they recapped everything towards the end with like the voiceover. And you just had to kind of infer everything that was going on screen as Lois and Clark were talking.
Well, it was over the end credits.
Right, exactly. I feel like they could have added like another 15 minutes to this episode just in the wrap up. The episodes were pretty short. Like each one was only a little bit over 20 minutes. So all in all, with 10 episodes, you're looking at 200 minutes of screen time. And that's essentially, just like the length of a feature film with a decent runtime.
Yeah, a feature film like Return of the King, maybe. Zack Snyder's Justice League.
Hell yeah! That's what I'm talking about. More minute for the dollar. That brings us to the end of season 2. I really enjoyed watching it. It went by pretty quick, I thought. I got to watch it with my girls, which was a lot of fun. I don't know if that added to my enjoyment of it, but it probably did. Again, it wasn't a perfect season, but I think it's definitely in keeping with how good season 1 was, and that I would definitely recommend it to basically anyone. It's an endearing and romantic continuation of the shonen anime adaptation of Superman's mythos, showcasing strong character relationships and themes, and I'm giving it 4 out of 5 stars, a fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes.
I would agree with that rating. Yeah, it's 1/2 star less than what we gave season 1, but there was a lot to enjoy this season despite its few shortcomings. I think the absolute best thing that season 2 did was introduce the character of Supergirl in the manner that they did. I thought it was a great adaptation, and I'm really excited to see where they take the character in season 3.
Yeah, I cannot wait for season 3. Again, it has been greenlit. We will be getting it next summer, so something to look forward to. But that does it for this review. AJ9K, help close us out.
Thanks for listening to Dynamic Duel. Visit the show's website at dynamicduel.com and follow us on Instagram at Dynamic Duel Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/dynamicduel and joining a tier that works for you, or by rating and reviewing Dynamic Duel on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podchaser, or on our website. Don't forget to listen to the other shows in the Dynamite Podcast Network, including Max Destruction, Senjo World, and Console Combat.
In our next episode, we are going to do another review. Just all these shows are just coming out at exactly the same time. Marvel has released season 2 of Hitmonkey. Now, if you haven't seen Hitmonkey, you fucked up. You got to see season 1 of Hitmonkey because it's fantastic. And he's one of Marvel's more interesting characters, I think. So look forward to our review of Hitmonkey season 2 coming out next week.
I'm looking forward to watching it. I can't wait. I loved season 1. So this is going to be good, I hope. I imagine it will be. But that's a wrap for this episode. We want to give a big thanks to our executive producers, Ken Johnson,
John Starosky,
Zachary Hepburn,
Dustyn Balcom,
Miggy Matanguihan,
Brandon Estergard,
Nathaniel Wagner,
Levi Yeaton,
Austin Wesolowski,
AJ Dunkerley,
Scott Camacho,
Gil Camacho,
Adam Speas,
Andrew Schunk,
Dean Maleski,
Devin Davis,
Joseph Kersting,
and Josh Liner for helping make this podcast possible. And we'll talk to you guys next week.
Up and away!
True believers.
I'm more than a bird, I'm more than a plane, I'm more than some pretty face beside a train, and it's not easy to be me.